Namaskar and a very good afternoon. Welcome viewers to this Gyan Darshan session. And today we have an extremely well-known philosopher from Department of Philosophy, Delhi University. We welcome Dr. Aisha Gautam, who has been teaching philosophy in the Department of Philosophy in University of Delhi since 2015. She obtained her PhD from Delhi University and her PhD topic was Moral Knowledge, Its Possibility, Source and Justification. She obtained her BA in Philosophy from Lady Shri Ram College of Delhi University and she obtained her MA in Philosophy from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. She has had a vast teaching experience. She has taught a large number of courses at MA, MPhil and PhD level and got a large number of published research papers to her credit, which has been published in peer-reviewed journals in the discipline of philosophy. She has guided both MPhil and PhD level students and executed administrative duties in University of Delhi. She has also delivered a number of invited lectures. She has bagged a large number of awards and honors for her academic contributions to the discipline of philosophy. This afternoon, she is going to speak on epistemology, past and present. With that brief introduction, now I invite Dr. Aisha Gautam to deliver her lecture on epistemology, past and present. Dr. Aisha, welcome to this session. We are at the School of Interdisciplinary Transdisciplinary Study, which has housed the program of philosophy both at the BA and the master's level for a long time. You are going to speak on epistemology, its past and present. So, can you please begin with a brief introduction to epistemology for the larger audience today? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kapoor, for that wonderful introduction. And, and I would like to thank the IGNOU for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on epistemology, past and present. So epistemology, as a inquiry in this discipline of philosophy comes from the Latin word scientia and the Greek word episteme. It refers to that branch of philosophy that deals with the theory of knowledge. Now, knowledge is something which is relevant not only for philosophy, but possibly or every possible discipline which one can think of. So among the most fundamental aspect of philosophical inquiry is a study of knowledge. And when we talk about knowledge, it is imperative that any claim of knowledge be evaluated for its validity prior to accepting it as knowledge. And in order to conduct such an evaluation, it is crucial to have a clear understanding of what knowledge is, how much knowledge is possible, how much of skeptical challenge can be considered a challenge for, knowledge, inquiry into knowledge. So as long as, these questions remain relevant, epistemology as a discourse will remain relevant. So before I begin to talk about how epistemology as a discourse, epistemology as a branch of philosophy has changed over what transition has taken place with the advent of technology and with the advent of these other developments which have been taking place, let me talk about some of the questions which we generally take up in some of the questions. There are many questions actually, so I will just be delving into some of the questions which can be considered to be epistemological questions. So, one can very well ask, what is knowledge? We do talk about, in our day-to-day life, we say that I have knowledge, I know, you know, we know. Can everybody claim that they have knowledge? When we talk about, Googling, suppose, I have to find out whether my laptop is not working well and I want to figure out how to fix it. And I check Google and I get to know about that. Will that be considered knowing, whatever knowledge, whatever information I have got from, Google and, when I implement it in the, applied realm and try to fix my problem, will that be considered knowledge? Okay, if not, if there is something called knowledge, can it be defined, or can't we define knowledge? If we can't define knowledge, then how are we talking about something like knowledge? Okay, so suppose, we say that knowledge can be defined. Then another question which one can raise is about the sources of the knowledge. What are the possible sources of knowledge? Can we talk about, our different faculties, perception, our hearing capability, our, verbal testimony, memory? Are these to be considered the sources of knowledge? If yes, then can we demarcate between something which is valid source of knowledge and something which is an invalid source of knowledge? That is another question which we verily take up in the domain of epistemology. Apart from that, we also talk about the very nature of knowledge. Is knowledge to be considered as a propositional knowledge, or is it to be considered as a non-propositional knowledge? The moment I talk about, propositional knowledge, one might ask, okay, why am I talking about this distinction between so-called propositional knowledge and non-propositional knowledge? The reason why I'm talking about propositional knowledge and non-propositional knowledge is because if you look at philosophy, the discourse of philosophy, how it has been doing epistemology, it has been focusing on what is called as propositional knowledge. Now, what is propositional knowledge? Those statements, those assertions, which can be considered as true. You can ascribe a particular truth value to them. That alone is considered to be the object of knowledge. Anything which cannot be evaluated in terms of its truth and falsity, that is non-propositional, and that cannot be considered as knowledge. So this is what this is one aspect of nature of knowledge which we inquire into. Now another, since epistemology has been taken up by so-called analytic philosophers. Analytic philosophy is what has been dealing with epistemology for all these years. So, one question which verily comes up in analytic philosophy is a necessary and sufficient condition for something to qualify as something. So when we say knowledge, when I say that I know, or when I say that Professor Kapoor knows, what are the qualifications? What are the conditions which Professor Kapoor needs to fulfill in order for her to say that she knows? Now, this inquiry is not a new inquiry. It all started aeons back, as I said, I began by saying that, the origin of the term epistemology is Greek. It comes from the term episteme, which means knowledge. Now, if you look at Plato, has had these dialogues, Theaetetus, Meno. So Theaetetus was this dialogue where Plato for the first time spoke about, knowledge and its definition. And there you would see that he goes on to say that knowledge is true belief with an account. Okay. Now that definition is what has been continuing till now. That definition is what is called as JTB account. Now JTB account is like again, if I were to confirm whether Professor Kapoor knows, I'll have to check these three conditions. Does Professor Kapoor has a belief? Now, what is the difference between belief and opinion? You'll have to have belief rather than opinion in order to say that you know. Right. Apart from belief, that belief should be true. If your belief is not true, you cannot claim that you know. And apart from, that belief being true, that belief of yours should also be justified. And then in epistemology, I won't be able to talk a lot in this, 1 hour talk. But yes, I can tell you that, when it comes to these three components also, there's a lot of, debate. What is the difference between belief and opinion? Is it about subjectivity and objectivity debate? When you talk about the concept of truth, what is truth? Is it correspondence? Is it pragmatic aspect, which is, which we are talking about truth? Like, let's look at this glass of water. How do I say that, the statement that there's a glass of water in front of me, that statement is true? How do we confirm that? How do we, how would, these truth theorists talk about it? So correspondence theorists would say that my statement corresponds with what is there externally. So that justifies the truth of that claim. A pragmatic theorist would say, okay, let me take this glass of water, let me have it. It quenches my thirst.
Yes.
So that statement is true. So, and again, there's something called coherence theory of truth. Similarly, when you talk about justification, we have something called foundationalist theory, coherence theory, and there is something called found herentism also. So there's a lot of debate about, how we should look at each of these conditions, how we should look at the concept of truth, how we should look at the concept of justification, how do we understand what is it to have a belief, is belief to be understood as an action, or is it to be understood as a mental state? So all those questions are very much there. Apart from that, obviously, when we are saying that we know, are we trying to say that we know anything and everything which is internal to us? Or can we also know something external to us? Can we know, world outside our minds? Can we know others, right? If yes, what are the sources? How can we say that we are justified in our claim which we are making about the external world? Or how can we say that we are justified in our claims about somebody else? Like, you have something going on in your mind, right?
Yes.
You have a particular claim which you're making. How can I be assured that, okay, that claim which you are making is something which I know, or the thing which is going in your mind is something which I know, right?
This is very interesting to know the other's mind.
This is another, the reason it becomes important because there's a lot of, always this question about the distinction between what appears to be the case and what is reality. Right? Yes. Very often, like when I talk about the distinction between appearance and reality, let's talk about, dream state and wakeful state. Very often, it happens that we're dreaming and we're like, no, we were not dreaming. That actually happened. So sometimes it gets very difficult to demarcate between appearance and reality. Again, if you talk about the AI, the present day, it's all about AI. It's all about, the realm which is all, about technology. Now, how do we demarcate between identity, which is pertaining to our, digital self, and, our actual reality? It has become very, difficult to demarcate between, these two selves, these two kinds of life we are leading. Which one is appearance and which one is reality? So that question pertaining to appearance and reality has always been an important question in epistemology. That's the reason why, there's very skeptical challenges which has been advanced against the possibility of knowledge. So that is again one question which you'll very come across in epistemological discourses. Then there's this question about the difference between truth and error, right? Suppose there is this rope in front of me. That's a rope, but, from the distance, I feel that it's a snake.
Yes.
Right? So how do I decide that, the perception which I had is erroneous or it is truthful? There must be some, so what is it that makes my justified belief justified? How is it that I'm able to demarcate between what is truth and what is erroneous? Now, again, when we talk about the concept of knowledge, what is the relationship between concept of knowledge and concept of truth, concept of belief, concept of certainty, concept of justification? Mathematics talks about indubitable truth. It talks about certainty. So when we are talking about knowledge, are we aiming for that certainty, which mathematics talks about? Or are we talking about, justification, which is not to be equated with certainty, but something lesser than something which is lesser than certainty? So, all these questions, like if you are undertaking an epistemological inquiry, then you can expect yourself to be delving into all these questions. Now, this talk which I'm giving today is all about, how epistemology has changed over, last 20, 30 decades. What are the changes we are witnessing right now? So let me first talk about, what was happening in the past, starting from Greek philosophy, like when Plato talks about, knowledge and epistemology, to, analytic philosophy. Logical positivism comes into picture. Science, comes to have a huge influence, and that is where the so-called analytic epistemology starts. So there was this, one can actually talk about three phases, So first phase is the so-called ancient philosophical framework, where you have people like Plato and Aristotle. So they were not only concerned, when they spoke about episteme or epistemology, they were not only concerned about knowledge, they were also concerned about something called understanding. There's a difference between saying I know, and there's a difference between saying that understand. When you say I understand, there's a little bit of transparency there, which is not there in the case of I know.
Yes.
So in that, when you talk about that ancient framework, these questions of, understanding and, knowledge and wisdom, these were important. And, another thing which was distinctive was that they were talking about both propositional knowledge as well as ability knowledge. Know that and know how. When logical positivism comes into picture, when analytic philosophy takes up, know how somewhere down the line disappears. I won't say it disappeared, but know that is what became important. Because, it was all about, propositions. It was all about propositional truth. It was all about, whether you can put something in the paper and say that this is true, this is false, and this is something which cannot be ascribed any truth value. So you cannot consider it as a valid kind of inquiry. So that is what was happening. So one, we have obviously, ancient philosophy where these know that, know how, understanding, value of knowledge. Why is knowledge valuable then, these other states? If one were to say that, okay, it would suffice if you have true belief, then why is it that we should get into that inquiry pertaining to knowledge?
Yeah.
We should only try to get hold of true beliefs, as many true beliefs as we can have. But we're not satisfied with true belief. We say that, no, we need to have knowledge. So this question also becomes important, that why is it that knowledge as a state, as a, either an action or as a mental state comes to play such an important role? Now, so this is, this was about, what we are calling as ancient framework. When, obviously when analytic philosophy comes into picture, analytic epistemology also comes into picture, there the inspiration is Plato. So they all start with Theaetetus, the JTB account. So what becomes the center of evaluation? Your beliefs, right? So, again, the three conditions. You need to have a belief. That belief ought to be true. That belief ought to be justified. That is what traditional epistemology starts doing. In fact, knowledge and justification were the primary object of investigation in analytic epistemology. You see that there's this problem. There's a problem which is called as raft versus pyramid problem. Mm-hmm. The problem of choosing between foundationalist theory and coherentist theory. That becomes a problem, a very important problem. Skepticism is something, skeptical challenge is seen as the most important challenge. What was happening in, ancient framework was that skepticism was not seen as a challenge. They were assuming that we know. Okay, there's a challenge of skepticism which will be there. But what we need to understand is that, okay, do we know? Are we in a position to, understand certain things? Can we have wisdom? That is what they were doing. Skepticism was not a big challenge. But in analytic epistemology, skepticism becomes a big challenge. They go on to talk about whether, you can talk about certitude in the case of knowledge. What sort of justification can we talk about? Should we stick to foundationalism, or should we stick to coherentism, or should we talk about some other alternative, right? So these questions about definition, nature, value, whatever inquiry which was taking place in analytic epistemology, it had its inspiration in Plato's Theaetetus and Plato's Meno, but they didn't, they never understood that something which was happening there was not happening here, right? Skepticism was not a challenge, it was a challenge, but they were not taking it very seriously in the ancient framework. But here it becomes important. Why? Because certitude is what becomes important. For, in analytic epistemology, it's all about attaining certitude in your epistemological questions. If you're not able to attain certitude, then you cannot perhaps proceed further. So, you'll see that JTB account takes a lot of,
sorry, Dr. Aisha, I just need a clarification.
Yeah.
By certitude, you mean the certainty?
Certainty.
Right.
Certitude is also, certitude is a term which has been used by, philosophers like Descartes and others. So, that's why, so there's,
Yeah.
but yeah, certainty and certitude are to be taken as synonyms, yeah. So because mathematics becomes the inspiration when it comes to what you're calling as analytic epistemology. They wanted to have the same certainty which you would come across in mathematical knowledge. Can we talk about, moral knowledge having the same? Now the question which one might raise is that was there a possibility to talk about something called moral knowledge in analytic epistemology? The answer would be no. There was no room, because you cannot talk about the truth value of moral knowledge. So there were these kinds of knowledge which had no space in, analytic epistemology. Now, when you talk about, music, or for that matter, any other skill, you don't only talk about, propositional knowledge, you also talk about ability knowledge, the skill which comes with it, the practical skill which is involved in that knowledge. So analytic epistemology was just concerned with the propositional part. It was not concerned with the ability part. It was somehow not giving that much. There was a discourse on this, but they were not, the entire focus shifted to propositional knowledge when it comes to analytic epistemology. And apart from, as I was talking about JTB account, apart from JTB account, you'll see that in 1963, there's another problem which becomes the focal point of, what is called as epistemological discourse. That was what is called as Gettier problem. So Gettier went on to, question the very definition which was coming from Plato. He said that, it's quite possible that you may have a belief, your belief may be true, you may be justified, but it's quite possible that luck or some accidental factor may have enabled you to acquire that belief, acquire the true belief. So what about those situations where it's not, you're having a particular knowledge is not a matter of your skill being involved in that, but some luck or some accidental feature playing an important role. Suppose, let's take this clock, I can see that there's a clock in front of me. It's showing 4:20 right now, okay? 4:25.
Yes.
So suppose, this clock stopped yesterday, early morning at 4:25. But like when I see the clock, it is showing 4:25 and it is actually 4:25. But do I really know? If this clock would have, stopped at 4:30, I may not have known. I might have gone wrong in my knowledge claim. But the fact that it just stopped at the right time, those two, so it's all about, how luck and, these accidental factors do come to, influence our knowledge claims. So the question is, can we say that we know in these cases, or should we say that no, since there's a problem, or there's this notion of luck, there's notion of, chance coming into picture, we shouldn't define knowledge like this. We should perhaps, in fact, there's this philosopher, I'm mostly focusing on Western discourse, but it's not that Indian philosophical schools have not spoken about knowledge, but for this talk, I'm just focusing on, Western philosophical discourse. But you'll see that there's some philosopher called Sriharsha. He goes on to say that knowledge cannot be defined. And what he does is to take up all the definitions, and like Gettier went on to come up with some counter examples, like this clock example, or for that matter, he comes up with 3-4 examples, cases, and he shows that, see, you're fulfilling the 3 conditions, but you don't know in all these cases. So similarly, Sriharsha comes up with these examples, 3-4 examples. He says those cases are called Sriharsha cases. He said that, see, you're fulfilling all these conditions spoken about by the epistemologists, but you don't know. Okay, so so again, it has remained a question whether we should come up with a definition of knowledge, or we should just start with that inquiry, saying that there is something called knowledge, and then we can take up the inquiry. There's no need to define knowledge. So Gettier problem, having challenged, the so-called traditional definition, I've spoken about two, 3 problems which are very much there in so-called analytic epistemology. You will see that apart from these questions, value problem also happened to be an important problem which was being taken up by some philosophers. But again, I would say that Plato wrote two dialogues. One was Theaetetus and another was Meno. Theaetetus is where he's trying to talk about the nature of knowledge, definition of knowledge. Meno is where he spoke about the value of knowledge. In analytic epistemology, the focus was Theaetetus. The focus was nature or definition of knowledge. Now, this value problem, some philosophers spoke about value problem, but there was no detailed discussion on value problem. Value problem was not considered a very important problem, in analytic epistemology. But if you look at the current discourses, the contemporary discourses on epistemology, you will see that there's a revival of some of these problems which were not being taken up previously. So, what I have done, if you look at this slide, you'll see what I've done is to talk about, some of the problems which we have been grappling with since eternity, and analytic epistemology was looking at, some of these problems, be it the problem of finding an apt definition, be it the problem of choosing between raft and pyramid, be it the problem of skepticism. As I said, attaining certainty was very important, because they wanted to compete with mathematics, and obviously, 1963 onwards, you will not come across any epistemological work which was not talking about Gettier problem. Gettier wrote this very short paper, 2 pages paper, and it became so important that nobody, in epistemology was able to proceed further without answer Gettier. So Gettier, you'll see that this is what happens. But so I have, right now, what I tried to do is to tell all of you about, what was happening in the, past, when it comes to epistemology. What are the questions we were delving into? But it also becomes important to talk about, what is happening in the present? What developments have taken place in the last 2 decades? Where are we moving as far as epistemological inquiry is concerned? So you will see that in the last 2 decades, we have witnessed a development of very distinct and novel approaches in epistemology. So there's something called virtue epistemology. There's something called knowledge-first epistemology. There's something called reformed epistemology. There's something called applied epistemology. So there are different approaches which are coming up. Now the question is, what is the need? Why is it that in the last 2 decades, there's there's an upsurge of so many distinct approaches? So let me, briefly talk about these 3-4 approaches which I have spoken about. So one of the, the most prominent approach which you will come across in epistemology right now is virtue epistemology. In fact, the most contemporary leading epistemologists who are alive today, they are doing virtue epistemology, be it, Ernest Sosa, Greco, Linda Jakubowski, Miranda Fricker, Van Wyck, and I can go on and on, Jennifer Lackey. They're the prominent epistemologists who are alive today, and they're doing virtue epistemology. So in the last 2 decades, this, inquiry, this approach to epistemological questions have, really come up in a very larger whatever. So I will talk about what virtue epistemology is, in a while. But let me talk about these other approaches also. So there's something called knowledge-first epistemology. So this knowledge-first epistemology, all those people who are doing it, they say that, listen, you don't need to talk about belief, truth, and all of that. You don't have to define knowledge. Let's start with knowledge. Let's start by, presuming that there's something called knowledge, and then you can take up these other inquiries. So that is what knowledge-first epistemology is doing. There's something called reformed epistemology. Now, reformed epistemology has been there since eternity. Reformed epistemology is nothing but, epistemology pertaining to questions of religion. Right? What is it to have a religious belief? Can we talk about truth in, religious discourse in the same way in which we talk about truth in mathematics or philosophy? So reformed epistemology is all dealing with questions pertaining to knowledge which you'd come across in religion, in the discourse of religion. Now, there's something called applied epistemology. So, since eternity, we had applied ethics, we had applied metaphysics, but applied epistemology, application of whatever theories which you have was something which was not happening. But right now you will see that, there are so many handbooks. Last, as I said, 1 decade or so, there's so many works which are on applied epistemology. So there's this need which has been felt that to do applied epistemology, to apply these epistemological questions to our day-to-day inquiries. Be it, the discourse of artificial intelligence, be it the discourse of, all these arenas which are getting affected by technology. So we can talk about Googling. Now people use this term Googling, right? Like, Google has become so famous that
Yes.
we rarely say, oh, I'm Googling. Now the question is, can we compare, the knowledge? Is there a comparison which can be made between perceptual knowledge and what is called as Googling? Suppose, I have to cross the road. What will I do? I will use my perceptual faculty. I'll see left and right, and then I will cross, right? So I've made use of my perceptual faculty. I've made use of my other faculties so as to, enable me to cross the road. But now, in present day world, what is happening? Whenever I have a problem, I have to find the direction. Like, while coming to IGNOU, the first thing I did was Googling. Okay, where is it? So, there's so much of reliance on Google, right? For acquiring knowledge, for solving our practical problems.
Yes.
Again, so, there's so much of information which is there in internet, and we are relying on that. Can that be considered as a apta pramana, or the apt source of knowledge? Is there some validity which we can attribute to all these information, all these knowledge which we are getting from, technologies these days, these internet and all of that? If yes, then why? Are they, can we compare, in epistemological discourse, there's room for different kinds of knowledge. So, there's a heavy reliance on testimonial knowledge from testimony, knowledge from verbal testimony. Because since eternity, we have been relying on verbal testimony. Now, the question is that, there we did have some parameters which you ought to, you should have fulfilled in order for you to say that, yes, you have knowledge. There was this concept of apta, or, valid verbal testimony, that you should be seen as an authority, you should be seen as trustworthy, you should be seen as somebody who's competent, right? Now the question, so that competence, that trustworthiness, all these things, all these features, all these criteria, which we were talking about in the case of verbal testimony generally, can we transform those, features here? Can we talk about, the same attributes being there in the case of technology? Can we talk about the same attributes being there in the case of verbal testimonies, which we are talking about in the case of technology? Can we say that, there's a problem which we see right now? One of the problems which we have been dealing with is the problem of fake news.
Yeah.
Right? Every moment you have so much of information coming from everywhere, it becomes difficult to decide what is to be taken as a valid, credible source and what is to be taken as a source which is erroneous.
Right.
So the thing is that, see, when any information is coming from a person, like if any information is coming from Professor Kapoor, I know that there would be some credibility. I would believe in that knowledge claim because it is coming from Professor Kapoor. Now the question is that there is some, like when Professor Kapoor is, telling me something, there's some authenticity there because it is coming from Professor Kapoor. Now, when we talk about all these testimonial knowledge which we come across in internet, in social media, very often there are no authors. It's authorless.
Yes.
So if there's somebody, you can say that, okay, since this knowledge is coming from this person, perhaps, I can think about it being valid or invalid because it is coming from, there's a competent, trustworthy person. But very often that is something which is not happening in the case, because what is happening there is that it is simply the result of a particular mathematical computation which is happening in AI. It's a result of algorithm, right? So it's a mechanical thing,
Yes.
There's some input, data which has been put in the machine, there's some tabulation which happens, and the end result is, whatever information which you are given.
Right,
So there's
right.
nobody. So see, in fact, many scholars would claim that because there's some computation, there's some algorithmic thing which is happening there, that is more trustworthy.
Yes.
But is it really the case? Not at all. Because half of the time, you might have been, all of us, very often think that, oh, am I being manipulated? This so happened that, I was talking to somebody yesterday about jalebi. And this morning, all these, in Google, all these notifications which I was getting was about jalebi. So there was this obvious, question that am I being followed? All
Exactly.
my words are getting, so this is what algorithmic thing is doing. How do we really distinguish what is whether we are getting manipulated or it's actually we who are thinking? It is we who are using our credibility, our credential, our creativity to come up with some product.
Very
These days
interesting.
it has become very difficult. In fact, there's this philosopher, I'm talking a little bit not about epistemology. In fact, there's this philosopher, Susanna Zuzoff, who talks about surveillance capitalism. How there's, this entire information, the mechanism is being, leading to some sort of surveillance.
Yes,
So
yes,
that's why it becomes very important to be able to distinguish between appearance and reality, between
Yes.
what is fake and what is reality. So there comes the importance of epistemology. It is only and only epistemological inquiry, perhaps, which can give us a way, which can, show us a way as to how to solve these problems which we are facing in in internet, in any platform pertaining to technology. Now, I have spoken about, how transition has taken place, how and why it became important for epistemologists of the current era to not only talk about, the theoretical aspect, but also about the practical aspect.
Applied,
Because
yes.
if, applied practical, if you're not able to solve questions pertaining to practical aspect, then your inquiry becomes irrelevant. And as, philosophers, we have always remained important for any and every inquiry. In fact, philosophy is what is the starting point. So that's the reason why perhaps many philosophers are working on applied epistemology that can be pertaining to any realm. It can be about the profession of medicine, what is to be considered as credible knowledge there, or it has to do with anything pertaining to your technology, any and every form of technology. Now, so that is what, I was talking about applied epistemology. I did try to talk a little bit about what is happening here. Now, let me talk about, I was telling you that currently, most of the philosophers, most of the epistemologists, who are the so-called prominent epistemologists of our times, they all are somehow doing virtue epistemology. Now, the question is, what is this virtue epistemology,
Yes,
which
yes.
these so many philosophers, so many epistemologists have got interested in? Now, you'll see that there's a transition which takes place in ethics, where, earlier there was no virtue ethics. There was deontology and there was utilitarianism and all of that, and then virtue ethics comes into picture. Similarly, in epistemology, there was nothing called virtue epistemology. There was only and only analytic epistemology, or the classic epistemology. But in the last 20 decades, in fact, it was all started by these two philosophers, Ernest Sosa and Greco. What these people thought was that, the one thing they were clearly able to see is that in the epistemological discourse, agent was not there in the picture. So there's a speaker who claims that they know. S has a belief. S has a belief which is true, and that belief is justified. So it was all about evaluation of belief. It was not about evaluation of the agent. Agent was, so even a robot can say that I have knowledge, right? So because, it doesn't matter whose belief is it. Even if that belief is hanging somewhere, doesn't matter. So, what virtue epistemology did was to shift this trajectory. It said that enough of evaluation of just belief. Now, agent needs to take responsibility for what belief they have. So, in traditional epistemology, in the classic epistemology, while the primary object of epistemological evaluation was belief, what happens in the current discourse of virtue epistemology is that agent becomes the primary object of evaluation. There's some evaluation happening, right? Now, the question is, when you are evaluating an agent, how will you evaluate? Would you evaluate the agent in terms of the consequence which that their action has? Or will you evaluate the agent on the basis of some virtues which they have? In fact, what is being called as virtue epistemology has been taking inspiration from what is called as Aristotle's work, virtue theory. What is Aristotle's virtue theory? And in virtue theory, what Aristotle gave a lot of importance to is the concept of excellence. So if you're an actor, if you're performing an action, your action should be excellent. If you are claiming that you're a knower, you should be an excellent knower. Right? So this question, the reason why virtue term comes into picture is because they want to get into the epistemological picture this notion of excellence, that it is not enough for us in the present context where there's so much of influence, external, internal influence. It becomes important for us not only to become reliable or successful, but it has also become important for us to become responsible. When we are inquirers, we all are researchers, we inquire about so many things, and we very often rely on different sources. And the very fact that we are human beings can, influence our inquiry. We all have some or other biases,
Yes,
right? So those biases can very well get into the picture and make that inquiry irresponsible. Or, there can be some injustice which can happen in the due process.
Yes.
So, so
You
these
mean
people...
subjectivity, right?
Yeah. Suppose, I have some biases against old people, right? So every claim which I will make about old people will be reflective of some biases, even if I'm not careful.
Yes.
So that is why it becomes important that if I am an inquirer and if I have some biases, then the first thing which I should do is to get rid of it.
Yes.
I will have to look for a way in which I can get rid of it. So epistemic virtues, or what is called as intellectual virtues, comes to play an important role. So, like if I am a knower, okay, what sort of intellectual virtues should I have? So there's some philosophers who go on to say that, as long as you have, all your faculties working perfectly well, your perceptual capabilities, your hearing capabilities, or any memory, whatever capability you use for knowing something, if that is working perfectly well, then your job is done. That is what is intellectual virtue. There's some others, so these are reliabilists. For them, succeeding is important. What is succeeding? Hitting the mark of truth. You are a knower, I am a knower. What are we doing? We are trying to arrive at truth. So that truth is what we have to hit. Like if there's an archer, that archer will hit the target, no? Similarly, if I am a knower, what should I be hitting? I should be hitting the mark of truth. I should be able to arrive at truth with my inquiry.
Yes.
Right? So that what some of these virtue epistemologists, reliabilists, go on to say is that hitting the mark of truth reliably, successfully is what is important. There are some other scholars who are called as responsibilists. They say that, okay, hitting the mark of truth is important. That would remain important. But apart from that, what becomes important is whether your hitting the mark of truth was responsible or not. Whether, there is some responsibility. So, there's something called intellectual humility, intellectual courage.
Yes.
Right? So they, all these responsibilists, they go on to talk about these virtues, inculcation of some of these virtues, they believe is important, intellectual carefulness. Because if you don't have these virtues, then it's quite possible that you can end up, committing some injustice. Like what transition has happened? There was a time when, questions pertaining to ethics, question pertaining to politics was not considered as relevant for epistemological inquiry. But now that has become important, that, you cannot completely say that now I'm doing epistemology, now I'm doing ethics, now I'm doing politics. You have to bring them together. That would be what can be called as a holistic inquiry.
Yes,
now another change which you'd see is that epistemology is being seen as a normative inquiry. There's one thing in saying that what is knowledge, who can be considered as a knower, and all of that. There's another thing to say that, okay, how we ought to form beliefs, how we ought to assess the evidence. So this movement from is to ought is also becoming important. It won't suffice for us only to be an inquirer, but we need to know how we ought to become a good inquirer, how we ought to become good knower, how we ought to reconcile between different sources of knowledge. Suppose, I'm reading one book which gives me information A. There's another book which gives me information negation A. The two sources, opposite content.
Yes.
They're opposed to each other. Now, how will you reconcile these contradictory information? Right? You as an inquirer has to reconcile, right? You have to, pick up something, and you'd say that you have to take something as a starting point. And, that can happen, that happens very often. And that creates a dilemma. And there, inadvertently, you will have to make a choice. So when you make a choice, then it becomes important for you to make a choice as a responsible agent. That there comes this question of responsibility, that I am making a choice. My choice shouldn't affect somebody in a negative manner. I shouldn't, my action as a knower or as an inquirer shouldn't end up doing injustice to, I shouldn't be, committing some injustice. For that matter, let me take an example which has been given by another very prominent virtue epistemologist, Miranda Fricker. She says that, suppose, in a classroom, you're teaching, and you will have n number of students, right? And you go on to decide whether to give importance to the question of a student A or the question of student B on the basis of the attire which the student is wearing, or on the basis of accent which that student has. What would happen? You have obviously committed injustice. Your, assessment of the question of the student was not based on the metal of the question.
Right, on the
merit of the question.
Merit of the question.
But it was based on what presumptions you had about, what is it to be a, good student, or what is it to be a good informer, or what is it to be a, something of that sort.
Yes.
So, so this is, this is something very revolutionary, that we are talking about something called epistemic justice and injustice. That we as knowers, we as inquirers, we need to make sure that we are not only being a knower, but we are a good knower. There's this concept of sensibility and sensitivity, which Miranda Fricker and, there are other scholars who, try to get into the field of epistemology. These were, questions which were not being spoken about, So if you are an epistemologist, I would say, in the, when analytic epistemology was the focal point, what was happening at that time, that if you are someone who is talking about something like, injustice, justice, responsibility, and all of that, you'd not be considered as a serious epistemologist. You'd be like, oh, listen, you're doing ethics. This is epistemology. We are, we are known for our rigor. And this rigor is somewhere down the line getting, compromised when you start talking about justice, injustice, responsibility, and all of that. But that change you'd see is happening. We're talking about intellectual virtues in terms of intellectual carefulness, intellectual courage, and, many other aspects, right? So that change is definitely something which has happened in the past 20 years. Another thing which is, as I said, which you can very well see, is that it is becoming, epistemology, like other branches of philosophy, is becoming applied. That was never the case. Previously nobody was talking about something called applied or practical epistemology. So you will have work on epistemology of AI, you will have work on Google epistemology and whatnot. So, like when you'll talk about AI, epistemology of AI, these questions become important. Can robot be considered as a knower? Can algorithms be given the same status which you would be giving to a human knower,
Yes.
right? If there is something, if we are making room for these AI technologies, and we are saying that there's some epistemic practices which are there also, then how is it that these traditional practices which you would come across in AI and you would come across in any technology for that matter, how would those traditional practices be how would those epistemic practices be different from traditional epistemic practices? What is this new perspective which AI and these other technologies are getting into picture? Can we now, since virtue epistemology, inquiries like virtue epistemology has been talking about the inquiry being normative, the inquiry being able to make room for intellectual virtues, so the question is that, can we make use of those issues, those concepts, when we are trying to undertake an inquiry into so-called applied epistemology? How do we like when we talk about testimonies in different realms, how is the testimony in the digital realm raising problems which were not being raised in the in the real realm, when we're talking about reality, which is not digital, right? So these are questions which which were not very these questions were very much there previously also, because if you look at Aristotle, Aristotle's physics, that was one of the prominent work. There Aristotle went on to make a distinction between what is called as what is nature and what is artifact. So this discussion about there being something called artifact, which is different from natural, it's not something which is new. It is something which has been, Aristotle wrote physics and all these works eons back, and those questions were very much there. But now those questions, the importance of those questions is becoming more and more relevant, because that is affecting our life. We want to, when we are making use of information, and when we are making use of technology, we want to assure ourselves that we are not getting into an erroneous path. We are in the right path. We are able to hit the mark of truth. So, like, to conclude, I would want to say that, what has happened in the last 20 or 30 decades is that, there are these diverse approaches which has come to epistemological questions. And through my presentation, what I try to do is to give an insight into how these variation, how these changes have brought this another important inquiry into picture. As I said, these questions about epistemic injustice.
Yes.
Epistemic justice, they are important, and they are not only important for philosophers. This very discourse of epistemology is not only important for philosophy, it is important for any and every discipline. Because in any and every discipline, we are trying to acquire knowledge, and we are trying to be truthful. We are trying to make sure that our, inquiry is ethical, we are reliable. Reliability is what we all are aiming at. And we are also aiming at, there's so much of, in fact, any and every, PhD or, MPhil course, you would see we start with research methodology.
Yes.
And the first thing which we teach students is research ethics, right? What are we teaching in research ethics? We are saying that you don't have to engage in certain practices pertaining to knowledge.
Absolutely.
Right? So if we engage in certain practices pertaining to knowledge, that would be unethical. So see, that is exactly what is happening in epistemology. We are saying that when we are inquiring into truth, when we are undertaking an inquiry into knowledge, when we are undertaking an inquiry into the concept of certainty or justification, we have to follow certain parameters so as to make sure that we are not committing any form of injustice whatsoever. Our inquiry is both reliable and responsible. So, with these words, I would like to stop my
presentation.
Deliberation. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ayesha Gautam, for such an insightful and very motivational, that's what I found, a presentation on epistemology, its past and present, and you spoke about past developments in the branch of epistemology as a subject in the discipline of philosophy, as well as you spoke at length about the recent developments in epistemology, It has been a very interesting discourse, including facets of applied epistemology, justice and injustice epistemology, virtue epistemology, all these recent developments and theories and debates in epistemology. Thank you so much. We hope that we shall have you again in one of our Gyan Darshan sessions.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank
it was
you.
wonderful.
Thank you for your presentation. Namaskar.